In the middle of a raging storm, a cruise ship carrying over 1,000 souls loses power. The engines fail, and a huge wave shatters windows, causing freezing water to flood the decks. The Viking Sky is close to sinking. As it drifts towards rocks on the shore, its captain sends a desperate mayday call, and experts prepare for a disaster on the scale of the Titanic. This is a tale of shocking oversight, the story of how the Viking Sky cruise almost ended in catastrophe. On March 23, 2019, the Viking Sky was sailing through the infamous Hustadvika Bay area when its engines abruptly shut down. For hours, it had endured crashing 6-meter waves, and now at the peak of a violent storm, it was immobilized. Its crew frantically tried to restart the engines as the ship rocked from side to side, but as 90-mile-an-hour winds tore it apart, the situation couldn't be worse. But the luxury craft shouldn't have been so close to destruction. As we're about to find out, the incident was years in the making. The Viking Sky is one of 6 ships owned by Viking Ocean Cruises. It specializes in luxury holidays, where guests can enjoy scenic views of the Arctic Circle and catch glimpses of the Northern Lights. But as an entertainment company, Viking Ocean Cruises doesn't have the naval expertise to maintain the fleet. Instead, once ships are built by Italian firm Fincantieri, its seafaring activities are handled by Wilhelmsen, a maritime service provider based in Norway. The Viking Sky is still considered a state-of-the-art cruise liner today, so when it launched in 2017, you'd think it had all its documentation in place, but conflicting reports suggest this wasn't the case. In 2016, Wilhelmsen engineers working on a sister vessel realized they lacked crucial information to maintain the fleet. Its engine manufacturer hadn't provided guidelines for the correct oil and alarm levels of its sump tanks. It seems a strange oversight for a $400 million ocean cruiser, but it's more baffling as the ship's diesel engines also generate its electricity, so if they failed mid-voyage, the Viking Sky would be left without power and propulsion. So, for several years, the fleet carried thousands of passengers on ships its engineers weren't even sure how to maintain. If this isn't troubling enough, the ship could carry 930 guests and 465 crew members. Despite those numbers, it was classified as a small ship.
Think of how many crew are on board. Then think of how many passengers. And then go and have a look and count the lifeboats. Remember the Titanic, chums? Wasn't enough lifeboats, was there? There's not enough lifeboats on the cruise ships today.
Unaware of these risks, the ship's largely retired passengers were excited to begin their 12-day cruise along the Norwegian coast. Beginning in Bergen, the route took passengers north to several towns, ending in a visit to Bodo. From there, they'd head south and navigate a notorious stretch of sea in the Hustadvika Bay area. The region is infamous for its shallow reefs, rough seas, and sudden weather changes, so sailors are on high alert to navigate safely while feeling the pressure to meet tight schedules. The first week of the cruise went as expected, and on March 21st, guests were enjoying a visit to Tromsø. But this is where the voyage ran into several issues. Severe weather was predicted over the next few days, and rival companies canceled the planned trips. But the weather wasn't the only thing wrong. In a regular incident for the fleet, one of its diesel-electric generators, DG3, was offline due to a faulty turbocharger. But the ship would run behind schedule if it waited in Tromsø for the spare parts to arrive. The Viking Sky also had a staffing shortage with its mandatory pilots. As expert navigators, 2 were needed to ensure the safe passage through a more challenging section of its course. However, one of the onboard pilots was only certified to sail up to Kristiansund, and the replacement pilot was set to join the crew after the most dangerous leg of the route in Hustadvika Bay. The captain and pilots were confident the ship could safely pass through the bay, and a technician on board could repair the generator when they reached Stavanger. Aware of the risks, they decided to leave Tromsø port in the late evening. But the decision broke maritime regulations. With one offline, Viking Sky wouldn't have enough fallback generators if the other engines encountered issues at sea. And as guests were about to discover, these weren't the only problems with the Viking Sky. Roughly 3 hours after leaving Tromsø, an alarm alerted the crew that DG2 had low lubricating oil, but it stopped shortly afterwards, so no further action was taken by technicians. The weather at this point of the journey was fine, and as the day progressed, crew on the bridge closely monitored increasing wind speeds. By morning, however, the captain was worried about reaching their next destination. Conditions were expected to decline in the evening, which could result in the ship being trapped when it made port. So after assessing the situation, he decided to cancel a planned trip to Bodo. Disappointed, he told the passengers the area was too dangerous to sail. Instead, the Viking Sky set course to Stavanger. Several hours later, crew were instructed to prepare the ship for deteriorating weather and secure loose items in the hull. But as the ship continued sailing in mellow waters inshore, the wind and waves became increasingly restless throughout the day. By midnight, the strong breeze had grown into gale-force winds, and the ship's logbook recorded 6-meter waves. It forced the captain to half the ship's speed to ensure a more comfortable ride for passengers. But if they thought their night's sleep was rough, passengers had no idea what lay in store come daybreak. In the early hours of the following day, multiple warnings registered on the ship. The first was another alarm indicating low lubricating oil, only this time it was for DG4's sump tank. And as the Viking Sky entered Trondheim, winds increased to a severe gale. Despite being sheltered from the full effects of the volatile tide by a series of islands, more alarms sounded as they crossed the Trondheim fairway. This included a second low oil level warning for DG4, and the forecast predicted that the already intense winds would only grow stronger. So the captain ordered a heavy weather checklist to be carried out to prepare for the onslaught. While this happened, over 150 warnings triggered for various systems, including additional low oil alerts for DG4. By this point, the engineer on watch had acknowledged 3 separate warnings for DG4, but each was cleared from the system without adding oil or investigating further. Meanwhile, passengers were served breakfast as usual, but a feeling of unease spread as they began to feel the effects of the emerging storm. Some struggled to stay on their feet. Others watched as glasses smashed and loose objects slid across restaurant tables. Eventually, engineers inspected the tanks, manually testing the alarms and recording oil levels towards the end of the forenoon watch. But the levels were judged to be normal, and in a few short hours, it would have serious consequences. As midday approached, the ship reached Hustadvika Bay, and one of the pilots left the bridge as expected. Now back in open water, the Viking Sky was rocked by 7-meter waves, and the captain informed passengers that a storm was coming. Less than an hour later, the weather was officially declared a violent storm. Open doors and windows swung uncontrollably against their frames as gusting winds reached over 90 miles per hour. Shortly after 1 p.m., the crew reported it had finished the heavy weather checklist. This included topping up the sump tanks with lubricating oil. But despite marking the checks as complete, the tanks still hadn't been topped up. Due to their negligence, engines had been running low on oil for over 24 hours. And as the ship pitched and rolled in the sea, air was sucked into the lubricating system pipes. This further reduced the engine's oil supply and dramatically increased their load. But unknown to everyone, a fatal design flaw doomed the voyage from the moment it left Tromsø. On top of being underfilled, the sump tanks were around 40% smaller than regulations required. This was the final straw for the ship's strained engines, as they had reached their breaking point. In the engine control room, several alarms went off at once. DG4's oil had dipped below the minimum level, triggering an automatic mechanism to prevent a blowout. Both DG1 and DG4 started losing electrical power, which was followed by a low oil alert for DG1. The situation was critical, yet the warnings were ignored, and the engineer on watch simply cleared them from the system. Many floors above on the ship's bridge, the captain and pilot relaxed, unconcerned with the chaos brewing below. So when DG4 and DG2 shut down in quick succession, it came as a complete shock. Both were caused by low lube oil pressure, and a flurry of alarms sounded at once. The engineer on watch immediately contacted the chief engineer, who quickly headed to the control room. With limited speed, the Viking Sky stabilizers automatically retracted, causing the ship to roll almost double the 6-degree angle it was before. Since those in charge weren't on top of the emerging crisis, passengers and staff were left in a vulnerable position. They were still serving lunch and moving about common areas, while technicians tried to get DG2 back online. Approximately 10 minutes later, DG2 was restarted by the crew and the ship's stabilizers were brought online. But this was only a temporary respite. DG2 shut down again, quickly followed by DG1, causing a total blackout. Facing massive waves and perilous winds, the ship had no power or steering. They were stranded, dead in the water. Panic unfolded among passengers, who wondered what had happened. In partial darkness, they huddled beneath flickering lights as the captain assessed the situation. A staff member describes the experience.
Everything was broken. Plates, glasses, furniture.
Back in the control room, the crew struggled to deal with a poorly designed alarm system. Up to 1,000 warnings sounded at once, but many of these were for minor systems, clouding the engineers to what was truly wrong. So when the captain called engineers, they couldn't estimate how long it would take to restore power. Seeing that the ship was drifting toward shore, he made an urgent distress call.
Mayday, Mayday, Mayday. This is Viking Sky. Engines failed in storm conditions, 100 meters from rocks. Request immediate assistance.
It was picked up by the Norwegian Coast Guard, who sprung into action, quickly launching boats to aid the ship. With help on the way, the captain tried to stop the ship. Both anchors were dropped, crashing to the seabed with an unnervingly rapid thud. But they couldn't hold in the massive swell, and the Viking Sky continued drifting, damaging the anchors as they dragged along the seafloor. While the guests feared for their lives, the crew fought desperately to get the engines back online. They finally realized low oil pressure was the problem and started transferring oil into the sump tanks. But poor training meant they hadn't practiced restoring power without a backup generator, so steps to reset the engines weren't completed in the correct order. At this point, one of the pilots took over communicating with rescuers, and the captain prepared the ship for evacuation.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is the general emergency signal. For all crew, please get into your emergency positions, and for all guests, please proceed to your muster stations at this time, either muster station A or B.
To their credit, passengers remained as calm as possible, and then some good news came from the engineers. They managed to reset DG2 and restore limited power to the vessel, meaning there was a fighting chance of firing up the propeller motors. However, not long after, the Viking Sky drifted over a rock with only 4 meters of clearance to the ship. Experts later warned it was only minutes from running aground, becoming one of the worst maritime disaster stories in modern times. Half an hour later, passengers were anticipating their rescue when a massive wave hit the ship near the second muster point. It smashed through windows and ripped a heavy metal door off its hinges, causing ice-cold water to flood through the ship. Some were injured by shards of glass and other loose objects, with the most serious injuries including a broken neck when the door struck passengers. If the situation wasn't salvaged soon, there was a real risk that hundreds of people could freeze to death in a hostile sea. A passenger on board the cruise describes the experience.
I ended up sliding across the floor, and then when the ship rolled back, I came back. And I ended up under a table, and the table was pinning my leg down there, and I was up to my neck in water.
Seeing the urgency of the situation, the Coast Guard couldn't attach tow lines to stabilize the ship, which was listing as much as 30 degrees. With no other option, they returned to shore, and the Coast Guard dispatched 6 helicopters to airlift passengers to safety. They reached the Viking Sky moments after water entered the hull and immediately prioritized the injured and most vulnerable guests. But progress was steady, and rescue workers could only move as quickly as conditions allowed, so they winched passengers 2 at a time to speed up the operation. Throughout the next hour, DG1 and DG2 were brought back online. This, at last, gave Viking Sky a slim chance to avoid the shallows, albeit at a modest speed. And not long after, a Coast Guard vessel and heavy tugboat Vivax reached the ship. To the relief of all on board, they helped the captain navigate away from the reef. Even so, the ship struggled to get clear of danger entirely, and Vivax couldn't tow Viking Sky to safety, so another tugboat was drafted to help. But it would take some time to reach the area. As the ship crawled into deeper waters, DG2 briefly shut down due to low oil pressure, which was quickly resolved by engineers. It now had all 3 generators working, and in a place of relative safety, the evacuation continued through the night. By the early hours of March 24th, the tugboat Ocean Response arrived at the scene. Roughly 1,100 people were still stranded, even with rescuers working non-stop. Cold and wet, they'd been trapped for nearly 13 hours, waiting for daylight and an end to this ordeal. Mercifully, when the sun rose, the storm was beginning to ease, and tow lines from both tugboats were attached to Viking Sky's hull. Crew were also able to stabilize the vessel thanks to the calmer seas, and the rescue operation stopped not long after. In a monster effort, 460 people had been evacuated from the ship. The starboard anchor, so damaged it couldn't be winched back into place, was cut free, and the Viking Sky limped ashore, aiming to dock in Molde. It arrived in the late afternoon, and the remaining passengers and full complement of crew thanked God they'd survived. To his credit, the chairman of Viking Ocean Cruises apologized to passengers in person, and they were given a full refund for their holiday.
It could have been a very bad situation, and I think we are very grateful for the captain and the
In the aftermath of the voyage, Viking Ocean Cruises reported major damage to the ship's starboard or right-hand windows. Some were destroyed outright. There was also stress on the ship's structure and superficial damage throughout. The investigation into the incident found design flaws and a failure to maintain oil level as the main cause. It made over 14 recommendations, including newly designed tanks and improvements to ensure the ship's seaworthiness. Wilhelmsen and Viking Ocean Cruises also came under fire for contributing to the disaster. In particular, the decision to leave port at Tromsø, poor staff training in a blackout situation, and the failure to ensure 2 certified pilots were on board for the entire route. Both updated their staff training programs and introduced new procedures for monitoring and responding to alarms. They also altered company policies to ensure ships and pilot staffing complied with regulations. 18 people were injured, with only a single serious case. Despite this incident, the cruise industry is among the safest ways to travel, and it's a miracle there were no casualties. Watch this episode next if you found this video interesting. Please add a like and leave a comment if you want to support the channel.